What is up, YouTube and everybody live here at twitch.tv/the_control freak? We've got our next episode of the matchup guide series. I think we're on like episode 6 or something, where we're just going to be discussing different matchups in Modern from the perspective of the Death Shadow pilot. So today, the requested matchup was Blue White Control or Blue White X Control, whatever we want to call it. I'm just gonna lump it all in as blue white control, even if they're like splashing red for fire and ice, or splashing a couple triomes or shocklands or whatever for prismatic ending, anything like that. We're just all calling it all blue white control. So don't nitpick the name too much. We're just categorizing it as decks that are running cards like Solitude, Teferi Time Reveler, Jace the Mind Sculptor, Teferi Hero of Dominaria, um, what's it called? Wandering Emperor, Prismatic Ending, Counterspell, Archmage's Charm, Chalice of the Void, those kind of cards. Just decks that are looking at like answering one for one, except for sweepers, and then control the board or control the end game with value oriented planeswalkers, maybe in the game with like a couple man lands, something like that. So let's start with recognizing this is what you're up against. So from the shadow side, some of the biggest giveaways on your opponent's side of the field can be things like Hall of the Storm Giants, Celestial Colonnade, those big, like, huge activation cost man lands that can win the game as it goes late. Other than that, fetching up like a Jeskai Triome pretty aggressively could be a sign, or like a Bant Triome, something like that, Esper Triome, whatever it is. Can be a little bit of a hint, but really it's going to be like the big man lands that give it away the most. And then as soon as you start progressing into the game, cards like Counterspell, Archmage's Charm, Teferi Time Reveler, Kahira is a companion, all those sorts of things. So as soon as you recognize that your opponent is on blue-white control and you're like pretty convinced that's what's going on, you need to recognize that very quickly you have to become the aggressor, because you're not going to win the long game against like Memory Deluge and Teferi Hero of Dominaria, Solitudes, all that stuff. So you do have to be pretty good about like flipping that switch and getting on the beatdown plan. Cards like Ragavan, Dragon's Rage Channeler, Ledger Shredder all provide a little bit of pop. But ultimately, like, the current builds of Shadow that people are playing the most, these like Ledger Shredder builds, are not presenting the same sort of clock that Shadow was 4 or 5 years ago. So you do need to understand that like a lot of these cards are not going to be closing out the game as quickly. So Thoughtseize, Drown in the Lock, Expressive Iteration do get a lot more important. Kroxa, probably your single-handed best card in the main deck against these decks. Being able to provide a 2-for-1 body, sometimes a 3-for-1 if they kill it, as well as the occasional opportunity to like Kroxa and get a Solitude Evoke to exile it. So you've essentially just 3-for-1 your opponent off of 2 mana if you're able to get that with the Solitude, the card they pitch to Solitude, and the card they pitch to Kroxa. But realistically, you'd rather get your Kroxa back more often than not. Just be able to provide a real clock while also being able to interact with your opponent's hand to some degree. Chalice of the Void, a card you really need to look out for. If you're like on the draw and you don't have hand disruption in the blind, your opponent drops a turn 2 Chalice, game's probably over. Like, unless you have very specific draws of Ledger Shredder into Iteration or Bauble Iteration, ditch Kroxa, find Drown in the Locks, whatever. But more than likely, you're just going to be at a pretty big setback. So, not a whole lot you can do game one. Watch out for like Archmage's Charm stealing a shadow as game gets later. So there might be some situations where if your opponent plays like a Jace or a Teferi, uh, you might want to let it resolve, bounce one of your threats, and then kill it with like an Unholy Heat as opposed to countering it, because some of the spells that you want to counter, like Archmage's Charm, are just going to be you lose the game on the spot if it resolves. Like if you've beat them down to 3, 4 life and they take your shadow and just get like a free swing back to kill you, that's a lot worse for you than, oh, they bounced my shadow with a Jace, I unholy heated it, replayed my shadow, and I missed out on one attack. So just don't let yourself run into a situation of like the game ending on the spot, but especially game one when you recognize it's blue-white control and you've got a ton of dead cards in your deck, like Fatal Push, Unholy Heat for the most part, Terminate. You've got to take a risk. You're not going to be like grinding out the game into the late point, so you really have to recognize I'm against blue-white control. The odds are against me. I need to make something happen. I need to draw hot, or I need to find that one of like K command in the main, whatever it may be. But just don't get passive and try to play like a long game. So let's talk about sideboarding. So from the shadow side, or we can start with the blue-white control side. So this is just like a relatively neutral list that I found. I think this is the one that, yeah, 10th place in the last challenge. Leyline Binding's a new card that they've started playing. I've seen in some lists. Some lists haven't been running it, but you see a lot more various triomes in the list that are running Leyline Binding just to get that cost reduction. But against us, you might see cards like Dovin's Veto coming in, Subtlety. Let's check out some of these other lists. Spreading Seas is decent. Rest in Peace is decent. Celestial Purge for sure. Maybe Mystical Dispute, Extra Supreme Verdicts, anything like that's likely coming in. So what I would think about when you're going into sideboarding is like, how is the opponent going to attack my graveyard? Because things like Kroxa are such a big deal. If they don't want Kroxa escaping, they can attack the mana, because despite people's belief otherwise, Grixis Shadow is a pretty mana hungry deck. So like Spreading Seas on a Blood Crypt early can really set off your game plan for those first few turns there, especially when it comes to something like Kroxa. Dress down, a lot less prevalent, but board out, you'll often see things like Fire and Ice is a popular board out. Maybe 1 or 2 copies of the more expensive Planeswalkers. Dress down can usually come out unless they see like Territorial Kavu or Scourge of the Skyclave, something like that. But a lot of these things that like don't kill shadows and better threats are often going to be early cuts. So from the shadow side, we know that our graveyard is likely to be under a little duress if Rest in Peace is an option. Rest in Peace itself is not really enough of a reason to cut Kroxa. But maybe like Drown in the Loch. But honestly, I wouldn't touch Drown in the Loch until game 3, when your opponent has shown that they're bringing in Rest in Peace game 2. Mainly because it's just like one of our only hard counters. And so if you don't have access to it, then you're going to run into a rough time when you get to like the mid to late game and your opponent's top decking Archmage's Charms and Planeswalkers and stuff like that, if you're not able to hard counter those. Some people like boarding out a Shadow or 2 in the matchup, just because it's like a big vanilla threat that doesn't really do anything. It's awkward against Solitudes. So you could board out a Shadow or 2. Fatal Push is pretty bad. some number of like unholy heats, terminate if you're running those in the main are all pretty bad. Um, Everything else is kind of necessary. It's either direct disruption through hand disruption, counter spells, discard. It's card advantage with like Ragavan, Expressive Iteration, Ledger Shredder, or card selection. Uh, or I'd keep in like one or two Unholy Heat for Resolve Planeswalker. For the most part, if your opponent resolves a Walker and gets some big effect out of that turn, even if you kill it, you're still really far behind right there. So more often than not, it's not going to matter that you killed it after it resolves. You really need to try to be stopping it from resolving in the first place. Uh, Out of the board, Spell Pierce, Mystical Dispute, Flusterstorm are all relevant. K Command's good. But the real ace in the hole is Turok. Essentially, if you're playing any variation of Death Shadow, I think we've gotten to the point in Modern where you have to run some number of Turok. Like, I'm sure there's local pocketed metas where you don't have as much white base removal and Turok's not as necessary. But in like a Magic Online world, I would not leave home without at least 2 copies. So for anybody who doesn't know the impact of Turok, it's essentially 4 mana. Your opponent discards 2 cards at random for a 4/3 that can't be hit by Solitude, Little Teferi, Big Teferi, Prismatic Ending, March of Otherworldly Light, Celestial Purge, Leyline Binding now. So it's pretty much Cycle of Shark Typhoon, Supreme Verdict, or Counterspell it on the way down are like the only ways to actually deal with the card. But you can play around the counter spells pretty easily by either having like a Flusterstorm or a Dispute of your own on like turn 5, holding Turok until after your opponent's had a chance to tap off counter spells, or using your hand disruption to try to get a couple of those cards out of hand. Fire and Ice and some control. Yeah, fire can kill Turok if you didn't kick it or in response to the trigger once it is kicked. But if your opponent fires Turok after you've kicked it, you're still getting a 3-for-1 off of it, which is fantastic. Also dodges Chalice on 1, which is, I feel, undervalued but extremely nice. But when you've got these kind of Turok hands and you're able to curve like hand disruption into Kroxa, into a threat on 3 that your opponent has to deal with, into Turok on 4, it's really easy to kind of tempo blue-white out of the game. But it's also a 4-mana play, and you're not always going to have 4 mana sitting around. So I would consider playing out Turok on 2 if it means getting down Turok under like a counter spell, if you know they don't have like a Fire and Ice, or if you're okay with them casting a Fire and Ice or some removal spell on it. But just a 2/1 that clocks your opponent can do a lot of work. And that's got to be stated as its own little point, because I think it's something that people underestimate a lot. I often advise the same thing against like taxes, like bringing in Turok, playing out a 2/1, and just getting to combat. Because if you're able to stall out the game in other ways, then that's often going to be good enough. Switch Gaming coming in with the raid. Thank y'all so much. Hope you had an awesome stream. Welcome everybody. Michael here, or Control Freak on Magic Online. We're going over episode 6 of our matchup series. So we're talking about like Death Shadow variants versus blue-white control. And as soon as this is done, we're going to be playing a Donation League of Mardu Death Shadow. And then after that, some more something. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, like your game plan against blue-white control 9 times out of 10 post board is going to be revolving around like Kroxa or Turok, trying to get one of these threats down, because they're your best form of clocking your opponent while also providing disruption to the hand and a little more difficult to deal with body. So for other variations of Shadow, Talk about like Jund again. We've got Turok in the board. Uh, these kind of builds are going to not vary. They're going to depend more on cards like Seasoned Pyromancer, Liliana the Veil. Um, Again, we've got Kroxa, Ren and 6. But since you can't counter anything that your opponent's doing, you really need to revolve your game plan around like 2-for-1 effects out of your creatures and out of your planeswalkers and stuff. So like K Command gets a lot better. Talked about Spyro, Turok, just anything that provides you a little bit of like additional value plus a body is going to be kind of the way to go. Golgari that we've been playing a little bit recently has got access to things like Choke. You can bring in Beseiju to help deal with opposing leyline bindings. Some of these Shadow Blade lists have got like Teferis of their own, 3-mana Teferi. Batter Skull's often worth it just as an additional threat, but then these are more like your counterspell heavy shadow lists. So for the most part, if you're playing blue, like your sideboard plan heavily relies on counterspells. So some common ways to approach the matchup post board are you really want to look for hands that have like some sort of disruption, some sort of card advantage, and aren't susceptible to like one card or one piece of interaction from your opponent's hand. So what I mean by that is so some piece of disruption, like a hand disruption spell or a good counter spell. I wouldn't consider just a Drown in the Lock as being like a good piece of disruption, but like a Thoughtseize on one, or maybe a Mystical Dispute or a Spell Pierce or something that you can use in those early turns to make sure something sticks or make sure your opponent doesn't get to stick something. A piece of card advantage. So Ragavan is a good option. Ledger Shredder. Kroxa is a really good option, as well as Turok, just like something that gets you an added effect, in this case, getting a card out of your opponent's hand. And then, what did I say last? Disruption, card advantage, and some sort of like a threat. Usually Kroxa and Turok can kind of like fill those second and third slots by themselves, but maybe your hand is Thoughtseize, plus some sort of interaction like a Drown in the Lock or a Spell Pierce, and then your threat is actually like a Shadow, but you've got a Kroxa, then hey, I can start like focusing my game playing around Kroxa, get my opponent empty-handed, land a Shadow after they deal with the Kroxa, or vice versa. But just some way of like eating my opponent's resources as well as providing some sort of disruption on my own side. I think one of the popular traps that we fall into is looking at a hand and saying like, hey, this is a good shadow hand. Like, oh, it's got Thoughtseize into Death Shadow. I've got my one of Unholy Heat. I've got a Drown in the Lock, and I don't know, one of our sideboard cards. I've got a Fluster Storm. And we're like, okay, these are like good cards, but they don't end up being good cards in the matchup because you run into this pattern of, all right, I Thoughtseize my opponent. I took their removal spell for my Shadow. Turn 2, I held up Drown in the Lock and my opponent didn't do anything. Or they played a Chalice off no second land, and I'm looking at my Mystical Dispute or Drown in the Lock and Fluster Storm, and they aren't lining up well with what my opponent's doing. And then turn 3, I played out a Shadow, and they played a Teferi, and I couldn't Fluster Storm it or Drown in the Lock, and they reset my Shadow and drew a card. And like now I'm really, really behind because I kept this hand of like good spells, but not good spells, understanding what the matchup was and what was going to be expected of me in those first few turns of the game. So if you can, I don't advise aggressively mulliganing against blue white if you have like a functional hand, but don't put yourself in a position where your cards are just going to like line up horrendous the first few turns. Now, if like that Death Shadow is a Ragavan instead, and you get to start with like Thoughtseize on one into dash Ragavan on two into something else on three, maybe it's a little bit different. But when you have like a vanilla threat like a Shadow, it's probably going to be a lot more difficult to regain a lot of that momentum as the match goes on. So the big inclusion now from Blue White that we wanted to discuss was Leyline Binding. So Leyline Binding is going to give your opponent essentially a 1 mana, maybe 2 mana answer. There's probably going to be like 2 mana more often than not answer to things like Kroxa coming back or Kroxa getting cast the first time, Ledger Shredder, Dashed Ragavan, anything like that like Prismatic Ending might have missed before. So it's going to be more and more important to kind of keep an eye on the mana that your opponent has available and their card or their basic land types. So if we've got an opponent that's playing their blue-white base and maybe 2 off-color triomes, like an Esper triome and a Bant triome, something like that, then that Leyline Binding can get down to 2 mana at the cheapest. 2 mana is still a big commitment when it comes to playing in a matchup against something like Shadow that really emphasizes reducing the curve as much as possible. So 2 mana is not the end of the world for us. The flash, however, is a pretty big deal. So we're going to see a lot more dashing Ragavan into like 1 or 2 open mana to try to play around Prismatic Ending. Because now if your opponent has the Leyline Binding and they just get to exile your Ragavan during combat, then you probably don't have a lot of good ways of dealing with that. Cards like Spell Pierce, I think, are going to get a lot better in the early turns. Being able to interact with Planeswalkers, Chalice, Archmage's Charm, Counterspell, not expressive iteration, Prismatic Ending, Leyline Binding, anything like that in the first like 4, 5, 6 turns. Maybe not that long with Leyline Binding, but it will interact with something in those turns. So that's going to be something to keep an eye out for. Maybe you want to like add a 3rd Pierce to the board. Turok gets a lot better with Leyline Binding because now if they're hoping to hold that up instead of like a counterspell or something, and we're able to kick a Turok, get the 2 cards out of hand, and Turok is going to be protected from that binding, then that can be a pretty common play pattern. But we do have to recognize that like we don't have a good answer to Leyline Binding if it resolves. We can't EE for 6. We can put out more threats, but for the most part, like our same threats that were good against the rest of the deck are also reasonable against Leyline Binding, like Turok itself, Kroxa that's already gotten a couple cards out of hand and now gets a Leyline Binding. Ragavan, Channeler, Shadow are all going to get answered the same way they would by March of Otherworldly Light, Prismatic Ending, Celestial Purge. So I wouldn't think too much about how it's changing up the matchup. It does make it worse, however, if you're relying on cards like Liliana the Veil, Kaito, Royal Scions, things like that, like Planeswalkers that were normally hard for blue-white to interact with. Or if they had Prismatic Ending, they had to spend a bunch of mana to deal with it. It's sorcery speed. Now get access to Leyline Binding and are able to pop those a little more effectively. So it might turn out that your Kaido or Royal Scions or something in the board now needs to be a 3rd Turok or an additional counter spell, hand disruption spell. Maybe you want to play a duress, something. But there's just going to be a little more liability for jamming that Planeswalker out. Other than that, the only other thing I can really advise on would just be like, if you see the green or red splash, at least keep it in mind. A lot of these players like are not running any sort of sideboard cards to take advantage of that. But if you can afford to play around something like a Veil of Summer out of one that's running like a breeding pool and a Bant Triome, it might be worth it. Uh, Alternatively, if your opponent's playing a red splash, just keep Fire and Ice in mind. So if you have chances where you're not losing momentum or losing tempo by playing around those cards, it might be worth it. Uh, like if you've got a 1/1 shadow and your opponent's got Fire and Ice mana out, it might be worth it to just not play out the shadow as a 1/1 in the chance that your opponent does have that card. Just wait till next turn instead of giving them the opportunity to re-seize the initiative and knock out your shadow with a spell that would otherwise be pretty bad. So I believe that's everything. I don't know if anybody in chat has any questions about this particular matchup. If you do, we can answer those real quick. If not, we can move on to the gameplay. Let's see. Aether Gust is a card that could come in against some variants. I don't think it's that good of a card to bring in, but I don't play a lot of blue-white control, so I couldn't say what they're thinking. But for the most part, like cards that just put something back on top, give the decision back to us on whether or not we want to make them deal with it again. It's like okay against Kroxa escaping, but at the same time, that means Kroxa got a card the first time around, got the Aether Gust when it escaped. It'll get another card when we cast it again, and then like a fourth when it escapes again. So, not the worst situation imaginable for the shadow side. If your opponent's splashing black, look out for Kaya's Guile. Or those random players that play Kaya, what is it, Orzhov Usurper? Like the 3-mana Kaya that exiles 1-drops and exiles some stuff out of the yard. People are weird and like playing that card for whatever reason. See, a list of Bant Control that's running Veil of some. Yeah, so stuff like this. So this is like Bant Control running Veil of Summer in the board, along with Nissa Vital Force, go figure. But the rest of the deck is just blue-white control. So things like that, just keep a thought on the fact that your opponent can bring in stuff like that. So again, if you just have the chance where you can choose to play around it, try to. But if you can't play around it, you can't play around it, and don't try to, because you're just gonna like hinder yourself pretty badly trying to play a role that your deck isn't that suited for. So that's about it. Hope everybody enjoyed this recording. If you got any suggestions for the next matchup series you want to see, feel free to drop a comment below. Or if you're in chat and you want to see some other matchup, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, we'll catch everybody on the next matchup guide series. Adios for now.